that's it for us today. Okay, I don't know. Whatever it is, it's not right on the teleprompter. I don't know what that is. I've never seen that.
No, there is. We are going to do Sting, yeah.
Okay, but... Nay, I can't read it. There's no words on it.
Okay. Ready? Sure.
There's no words there. Play us out. What does that mean, play us out?
Sting is going to do, it's a video. Sting video.
What is...
For credits.
I don't know what that means. To play us out, what does that mean? To end the show?
Yeah.
All right, go.
In 5, 4, 3.
That's tomorrow, and that is it for us today. And we'll leave you with a... I can't do it.
Okay.
We'll do it live.
Okay.
We'll do it live! Fuck it! Do it live! Don't write it, and we'll do it live! Fucking thing sucks.
In 5, 4, 3.
That's tomorrow, and that is it for us today. I'm Father Charles Coughlin, and we'll leave you with Sting and a cut off his new album. Take it away.
Welcome back to Vampire Never Ended. This is Boris, and we're here with Father Fritz.
Hello.
And Rey. Rey, should you have some sort of like a Catholic monastic title?
I don't know Catholic monastic titles. What are they? I mean, it sounds fun, but...
You can be an altar boy.
Ooh, that's not so fun.
Yeah, it doesn't sound
bad
fun.
Things happen to them usually.
I was an altar boy. Nothing that bad happened. Nothing, that therapy couldn't fix.
Okay.
All right, well, why Father Fritz? Why the Catholic theme today?
Well, I'm honoring my heritage today. There was a time back in the day when in Texas, all you could really listen to on the AM band was, like various evangelical radio stations. And there was one Catholic station that I listened to all the time. It was so good because it had this show where people would call in to try to get answers to the paradoxes and contradictions that they had with the Catholic teachings. And these guys would try to answer it for 3 straight hours. And one question would take just an hour to answer, because the kind of hoops they have to go through here. And this episode is about Father Charles Coughlin, the guy that essentially invented the right-wing religious radio host. And I think we all owe him a debt of gratitude for people like Bill O'Reilly and Rush Limbaugh and all those other guys that we love so much today.
Awesome.
Yeah. Well, except that he was an outright Nazi, right?
Well, well, let's just see what he was. How about that? Father Colglin is connected to a lot of people in this arc. And I think he's the guy that, let's just get this out of the way, actually, because it's not really part of the story. But I think that this guy's the reason why the KKK dropped their anti-Catholic war.
Oh, interesting.
It was really when Coughlin was at his absolute height of both popularity and anti-Semitism that the KKK were like, Catholics are okay. But they play the KKK plays a role in Coghlin's origin story, by the way. So let's get into it. We got I got this whole thing divided up into 6 little mini parts to get a sense of this dude. We got the man, we got the voice, the rag, the front, the fall, and the grift. They're all thes. Mm-hmm. Huh? You see what I did there? That's harmony.
I'm kind of curious about the rag, but I'll wait for you to explain
the rag
to us.
All right. So let's talk about this man, Father Charles Coughlin.
So is it Coughlin, Coughlin?
It's Coughlin.
Cock. Hey, Father Coughlin.
Father Cock. So Big Daddy Cock is his name. He it's Coughlin, but a lot of people even on his own show, like he sometimes does these like fake dialogues with people, and sometimes his interlocutors will call him Coughlin, and he won't correct it. I don't think it mattered that much to him. I mean, he was born in Canada, and like all Americans, our names don't mean shit. Well, Coughlin was born in 1891 in Hamilton, Ontario. But let me just quickly tell you, just give you a summary of who this man is and why we're talking about him at all. So he, like I said, he prefigured this sort of mass voice from the religious right. He was by far the most influential Catholic in the U.S. before JFK. And actually, the Kennedys do play a role in this story. He ran this radio show from the National Shrine of the Little Flower Church in Detroit, in like a Detroit suburb. And at the height of this man's popularity, a third of the country was tuning into him on a weekly basis.
But when was this?
This would be in the 30s. So we're still interwar here.
Because you didn't accept the birth year, you kind of didn't give us a time frame. So.
You're so impatient.
Okay, sorry.
I'm trying to build mystique, you know? It's a man of mystery. He was not, I say he's a man of mystery. Now I'm going to tell you something completely obvious. He was also a good buddy of Henry Ford's. But also Joseph Kennedy and other like power players of this time. But basically, the short version of the story is that isolationism, the whole country turned against the isolationist position against the war after Pearl Harbor, plus the state crackdown and all that. So this is going to be another pass through that little period of time when like the Nazis like had a fighting chance in the U.S. So and then also because today, I mean, Colglin is not well known today, which is insane because this man was like fucking huge.
Say there are parallels here to the Italian American episode that we just did. Because it's another forgotten chapter. You're talking about even more people than the Italian American fascists, like over 1 million listeners tuning in weekly, and the guy was a Nazi. We just forgot about it.
Millions of listeners. Yeah.
How much was this like an Irish thing? Was his movement an Irish or not?
So okay. It's you'll see. It starts out. That will be answered in his origin story. Okay. Promptly. So I just wanted to point out though that as we're listening to this, note that there are people today who would like to rehabilitate Colglin, and it's easy to find stuff on YouTube where you have like contemporary Catholic, like these people I used to listen to, like radio people that would take questions and blah blah blah, who will just say straight out like Colglin was not an anti-Semite, and there's tons of quotes you can find of Colglin saying I'm not an anti-Semite, and also that he doesn't like Nazis and whatever, but none of this is true. I mean, this guy is like rabidly anti-Semitic and has a huge hard-on for we'll say that for the Nazis. So let's start
we're going with the Coughlin.
We're going with Coughlin. Yeah. So let's start with him, the good father himself. Then we're going to talk about the National Union for Social Justice, which may sound like something that would be against Nazis, but was not.
Father Coughlin, SJW, confirmed.
Yes. Also his like direct and indirect connections with the Nazi Party. And also this thing that I'd never heard about, which was the Christian Front, which was a massive militia movement based on Coughlin and his teachings. So let's start with the man, part 1, the man. Charles Coughlin was born in 1891 in Hamilton, Ontario, and he grew up between a gigantic fancy cathedral and a kind of a working class neighborhood. I don't know what that means, if he was like in the alley between these two. I imagine he had quite a nice house is the idea. So he entered theology through the Basilian order, which is supposedly mostly interested in education. And he gets ordained after finishing St. Michael's College, assigned a teaching position in another college, which is also Basilian. And he's there for something like 7 years when the Vatican determines that the Basilian order should become a monastic order. And instead of what they call a society of common life. And they required members from that point on to take vows of poverty and obedience and chastity. But Colglin was more interested in like getting rich, rebelling, and probably, screwing secretaries. So he obviously drops this whole Basilian thing. It got too real for him. So the church spends some time kind of moving him around Detroit until he finally becomes a permanent priest for the National Shrine of the Little Flower, which had served a total of about 25 Catholic families, Irish Catholic, in what was otherwise a Protestant suburb. And this is, the suburb is called Royal Oak. So, my understanding of this church is that it was built in 1926, like at this time that the father's getting there. Like they make a nice church for him. And only a few days after this church was completed, the Klan allegedly burns a cross in front of it, right? Which makes sense. It's They're Catholics. It's in their territory. It's what they do. But I've always kind of wondered about this story because, like, one of the things that Coughlin is, besides a celebrity and a priest and a Nazi, is he is a fucking shyster. Like, he's a liar. He's a chiseler, dissembler. So who knows? But the reason why I'm suspicious, even though this is like totally Klan, this is exactly what they would do, because there's immediately like a high production newsreel that is produced about this event, that is like shown around like movie theaters and shit like that. It's cut like a film. Like it shows Colglin at his desk writing when his actual secretary like runs in and like exclaims something excitedly. Colglin like looks up at her, closes this book, like stands up and rushes straight out the door to see this burning cross, which he himself like topples to the ground and begins to like stamp out. Like, as people around him like watch.
Excited piano soundtrack?
Oh yeah.
They want to fight. I'll give them one by radio. Sermons over the radio from my church. Somehow I'll get the money to do it.
Yeah. Yes. So I mean, this makes Father Coughlin instantly like a national news story. He's known now already. So he's got this like grand entrance onto the national media scene. So it is a little suspicious, Is
it like when Rachel Dolezal like hung a noose in her own locker and then?
I mean, maybe this is like this. Yeah. So, but okay. So let's talk about this church also. So I mentioned that it served 25 Catholic families, right? In many ways, this church is very traditional looking. It's like mostly wooden. But the Vatican, they gave him like a ton of money for this fucking thing. It was a very expensive church. And you gotta ask like why they didn't wonder why he needed 600 theater seats. Not like pews, but theater seats to serve 25 families, I mean, Catholic or not, that's a lot of seats. So Coughlin decides to try and fundraise against this loan himself by like, throwing the spotlight on himself. And he begins broadcasting his own Sunday sermons, on this radio station, WJR. And 3 years later, WJR is acquired by Goodwill Stations, and that's when all this shit really kicks off for him. The owner is a man named George A. Richards, who encourages Coughlin to focus more on politics and a little bit, mix a little less Bible, a little more politics. So, but at the time, Coughlin was already kind of playing politics, and he was almost certainly like anti-Semitic, but it's not yet really coming out. He starts out as like a dyed-in-the-wool New Dealer, like supporting FDR and all this. So he goes from having this like one station to having many stations across the country already at like the start of the year in 1930. All right, so that's where we're going to really kind of kick off his career. Coughlin is already like on the offensive against socialism and communism, and his primary tactic at first is to focus on like Christians being persecuted by communists in Russia, but then he kind of takes that as a jumping point to talk about the communist threat in America, and most of what he does is red baiting at this point. Again, he's still a supporter of like FDR and the New Deal. So his really big break comes when CBS picks up the show, CBS, for a national broadcast. And his rhetoric at this point is focused on international bankers. And if that's too coded for anybody, he does openly call out the Jews as well for masterminding, of course, the Russian Revolution, even though he claims in the same speech that he's staunchly against anti-Semitism, he's against prejudice of all kind. You know the story, blah, blah, blah. So just to
He's
give you
only
some
against
idea,
the bad Jews. I guess.
well, at this point, he's only against the international bankers and the
And
Bolshevik
Bolsheviks.
Jews. Yes,
We're
yes,
all
yes.
Jews. Yeah.
Well, we'll get to that. He's got a book, Ray. He's got a book.
Okay.
So Colglin's all right. So back in Detroit, the National Shrine of the Little Flower Church is getting like a super expensive makeover, like Art Deco stonework. There's like a gigantic, what really looks, in all honesty, like a huge stone dildo with like cross crucified on it in the front
Hell
of this
yeah.
church.
Father Coughlin.
Yes. Yeah. And also there's a huge radio antenna they put into the church. This church has like a fucking radio antenna sticking out of it now because he's broadcasting from the church itself, like from the fucking pew. I mean, when he does these broadcasts, he's like overlooking these like stadium seats and stuff. So his ranting gets a little too rich, we'll say, for CBS. And in 31, like just a year later, they tell him that they want to start to review his scripts before he broadcasts them from now on. And Coughlin is like, no. And so they dump him. But of course, like this guy already has himself, this high powered radio tower of his own. So he starts his own national network based on the infrastructure of his old home station WJR, which I guess he like owns at this point. And from this point on, 36 stations in America start to broadcast what is called the golden hour of the Shrine of the Little Flower, with this like lovely music at the beginning. It starts with like some organ music or some singing of Ave Maria.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of Father Colglin, whom I shall soon present, and on behalf of all those associated with him, I thank you sincerely for the splendid moral support which you are extending to this weekly broadcast. He has been insisting, despite all assertions to the contrary, that America is not interested in anti-Semitism. It is interested in anti-communism. All persons who have heard this recent broadcast are aware of this and are not disturbed by statements of those who refuse to receive the spoken, recorded words of Father Coughlin on this subject at their full face value.
What is this little flower thing? Do you know?
That's the name of this church. Oh, it's,
why?
It's called that because of a saint. I'm afraid I don't remember the one. It's like,
Okay.
honestly, it's not that important of a story. It was already called that because of whatever. They needed a name for it before Colglin ever got there. But I think also because they originally imagined this as like a small community church. They gave it like a nice small community name. The Church of the Little Flower. Come on.
Instead, it becomes like the first like mega.
It becomes the first mega church. Yeah, it's insane. All right, so, and way before there was, imagine the first couple sermons of this. Like, these 25 families come in and there's still like 90% left of empty seating around them as he screams at them, Amazing. So by 32, Colglin is still banging on the New Deal drum. And he popularized phrases like Roosevelt or ruin, and the New Deal is Christ's deal, which was going around a lot. The Social Security Administration estimates that at this time, so already by 1932, a third of the country is listening to this on a weekly basis, which of course means that this has grown well beyond like a Catholic audience. So he even testifies before Congress as late as 34 that the failure to elect FDR would result in a revolution, which would make the French Revolution look silly. That's what he said. So unfortunately for Colglin and for like everybody, Hitler comes to power in March of 33. So people have been noticing for a while that Colglin's rhetoric dovetailed very nicely with Mr. Hitler's. And in fact, a later text of his would prove to be a direct ripoff, like line for line from a speech that Goebbels gave just days before Colglin's own version. Now, we're going to talk about the Nazi connection a little bit later, but it is tight. So at any rate, the anti-fascists in the U.S., especially in the Jewish press, start to scrutinize Colglin a lot more, and he finds himself like more and more isolated from Roosevelt, to whom, like, okay, so Colglin feels that Roosevelt owes Colglin for Roosevelt's success. Like Colglin was like banging on national radio. He got phrases circulated, stuff like that. And Roosevelt starts to move away from Colglin. So Colglin gets increasingly butthurt over Roosevelt. Yeah. So he just goes like ape shit after this. He starts to just rail against Roosevelt like every week, saying that he broke all of his campaign promises. He was in league with the bankers and the warmongers, and he wanted to exploit and kill American boys. And his audience understood at this point implicitly that he was talking about Roosevelt siding with the Jews, because he had slowly, we'll play some examples and I'll read some too, but he slowly built up this relationship over time. And now like most people are, with him on it. So, by 35, the FDR administration starts to see Coughlin as a threat. But one that they can't really attack directly because they need those voters. They need,
and he's too
they
big,
need his
right?
people. He's too big. Yeah. So he sends his buddy Joseph P. Kennedy, who we need to talk about for a little bit because he is a freak. This guy, he's absolutely one of our freaks. Welcome, Joe, to the roster.
I'm grateful for this opportunity to speak to you. It's been a tough 2 months.
So Joe Kennedy and Coughlin were really tight. They bonded over being Irish Catholic, loving Roosevelt for a while, and like hating Jews. So I'm gonna jumble up the timeline a little bit just to give you a taste of like who this piece of shit is. So Kennedy managed to keep like his anti-Semitism largely under the radar in public life for a long time. And most of what we know about it comes from private letters and reports of like conversations people had with him and stuff like that. He's like one of these people that blamed the Jews for Kristallnacht. He thought that Jew media was manufacturing a war with Germany. He at one point claimed that his own party was controlled by the Jews. He sent
one of those people.
One of those people.
Yes.
Yeah.
Usually called Nazis. Yeah.
Nazis. So and on that, he actually sent his son Joe Jr. To study in Nazi Germany in 1934. So let's see what else. The German ambassador to the court of St. James, his name is Herbert von Dirksen, told his Nazi friends that Kennedy was Germany's best friend. Joe openly admired Hitler, would claim that his own party, I said that was a Jewish production, and he managed to stay in FDR's service throughout this whole thing until 1940 when he retired in Florida. But not before he fucking lobotomizes Jack and Robert's sister, like his daughter, for basically being depressed, and then hides her away in an institution.
Yeah. But
Total
also, I
mensch.
think later, I'm not sure, but I think I remember that he's like overtly pro-Nazi statements were later an embarrassment for Roosevelt or someone, I think.
Yeah, Roosevelt pushed him out. Yeah, Roosevelt had enough of him eventually.
Yeah.
It sounds probably more like he was retired instead of he retired.
Yeah.
Yes, he was retired. That's correct. Yeah. So Coughlin and Kennedy became buddies during FDR's campaign, but and then by 1935, like Kennedy's already heading the Securities and Exchange Commission for the New Deal and stuff. So he's like deep in the New Deal. So FDR thinks like surely Joe can get Coughlin to shut the fuck up for a bit, And like Colglin would say stuff on his radio station, like Joseph Kennedy agrees with me and stuff like this. So like he's really calling out, big names to back him up. And Kennedy's an important part of Roosevelt's administration. So FDR gets Joe to put together a secret meeting between FDR and Colglin. And they meet at some like cafe in secret. And apparently FDR walks in and like sits down in front of Colglin and just says, cards on the table, Padre. Which is fucking
That's
cool.
fucking awesome.
Like, that's a cool thing to say. So the meeting doesn't really go anywhere, but the press catches wind of it. I also wonder if there was some machinations involved in that, which wasn't really great for Roosevelt, because now there's pictures of Roosevelt and Coughlin sitting together, and the whole point of this was for Roosevelt to try to get Coughlin to like back off a bit. So, and even worse, at right from that meeting, Joe Kennedy and Charlie Coughlin, they go to another meeting with a potential financial backer who was going to be Coughlin's own third-party presidential funder, like for his run against FDR. Like they had already decided to do a campaign. So Coughlin's account of this is really fucking stupid, and it's stupid enough to probably be true because he really thinks he looks good in these meetings. So he tells us hilarious shit. So basically, wait a minute. Oh, okay. So I need to introduce another piece of shit to this story, and his name is Bishop Gallagher. And Bishop Gallagher was Couglin's big protector in the church. Whenever people were like, Coughlin, like, I think the shit you're saying is like anti-Catholic even. It's like, what are you doing here? Coughlin would say like, take it up with the bishop. And the bishop would be like, gumming down pieces of oatmeal and shit like that and just drool out an answer that he doesn't really care and shit. So like this decrepit bishop is Couglin's like defense against the rest of the church, because above that in the hierarchy the church was kind of like hands off. They the fact is a lot of people listen to this guy, and like when's the last time a third of America listened to a Catholic priest? Like never. So
the Catholics really do specialize in having these like slobbering geezers as high level important people.
Yes. So he was Couglin's like foil, right? So Coughlin produces in this meeting a copy of a check that somehow Bishop Gallagher managed to smuggle to Coughlin, right? And this check supposedly shows that the U.S. Secretary Treasurer Henry Morgenthau wrote a check to the Mexican Communist Party, and he's like, I demand an explanation for this. And Roosevelt's like, it's fake. What do you want? Like, that's clearly not real. Morgenthau hates communists. Like, we're in a struggle. We're still considering our relationship to the fascists. You know what I mean? So, but I'm sure he had this check. I'm sure he had it. Like, it also was clearly not real, but this is so Coughlin. He does this shit all the time. So he says that like this check was the reason for his break with FDR, that he found the evidence that FDR was secretly funding communists in Mexico.
Secretly funding communists. Trotsky probably would have been there at the time. So secretly funding Jewish communists in Mexico. Bam, double whammy.
Yes, where all the silver is, which becomes really important to Coughlin as well, as we'll see. So, and as far as like 1970, Coughlin claimed that he told FDR early on that Nazism was just another breed of Marxism, which is a fun reference to that trope. And also, and in 36, Coughlin does try to run for election. Fails and loses a bunch of national ground, but let's go back to his radio show for a bit before we continue forward with his career here. So this is part 2, The Voice. Yeah,
the guillotine, the machine gun, or the kerosene-drenched pit.
About the voice. Coughlin he would put like an Irish spin on a lot of what he said, but it was never really that pronounced. I think the voice was very sonorous, very dramatic. It changes tone a lot. But like, there's a difference between how he spoke on the Little Flower radio show, which was also called Power Hour or Hour of Power.
I always thought of Power Hours when you drink like a bottle of liquor really fast, like with your friends.
Yes, that is a Power Hour. Yeah. Yeah, also a reference to an earlier episode of ours on the bass, I think, when we had a show called Power Hour with Blake and Kiz, who clearly carried the torch. So so we know Coughlin as a priest. We know Coughlin kind of as is sort of what his politics are, okay? So how does he become like this national superstar? Skipping. All right, so Coughlin, there's footage of Coughlin's secretary pool. Like, I don't know how many women, but many dozens of them, like filing into the Little Flower Church.
His secretarial staff looks like big business.
To answer letters from millions of listeners. He would get like hundreds of thousands of letters a day, like to his church from people, and the secretary pool was there to like respond and blah blah blah, and as you know, respond with like, well, wouldn't you like to buy this boxed set of his sermons, you know, wouldn't you like this very cheap subscription to this blah blah blah. So he's like raking it in at this point. He's got hundreds of employees, millions of listeners. People are sending him donations, they're buying shit. Yes. So after Colglin turned against FDR in 1933, he went just like full fucking Hitler and started calling for the abolition of electoral democracy, political parties, and also he starts to really get into the anti-Semitism. And but most of Couglin's rhetoric as early as 1930 was about communism, right? Making sure that he threw in all the right dog whistles to the right people. So in 1930, he gives a lecture from his pulpit, remember, in his church to a third of America, focusing on how Adam Weishaupt, the founder of the Illuminati, was Marx's main inspiration. He calls him Marx's master. It's all focused on the widely, I would say, misread line that religion is the opiate of the masses. And this is what he's like obsessed with. He translates Marxism as destroy Christianity and civilization and we will be happy. This is his definition of Marxism. So the next week he singles out Trotsky from New York, Lenin from Germany, Bela Kun from Hungary, men from every nation who long since had devoted themselves to the anarchy, the atheism, and the treachery preached by the German Hebrew Karl Marx. Yeah, throwing it all in there.
So was he the person who like introduced the Illuminati conspiracy theory?
I don't know about that. I can tell you this though. He was pretty good friends with a guy we talked about in the Ford episode named Ernest Leibold, who was probably helpful in a lot of this as well. Yeah. Again, like he was part of this like Ford crew. Like he didn't go to, like he wouldn't get invited to all their parties, but he was around. Yeah. Like if they needed an extra guest to round out the table, I think they would call Father Colglin. So now listeners might notice a couple errors in his account of Marxism, but save your energy. It gets a lot worse. The speech also focused on internationalism, the same speech, which he not so subtly implies and continues to imply is another word for Jewiness. Yeah, that begins to become the word. Sure. And in fact, I think Coughlin can largely be credited to this being like such a widespread idea. So he says, as a matter of fact, the founders of this new communism are neither Russian nor English nor American. As a matter of fact, it was the Imperial German government in 1917 which sent into Russia the revolutionary leaders who had been gathered from the gutters of every nation. And he goes on to say like, okay, so all these like communist daddies are not Russian. And then he immediately gives us a list of people, including a Russian, and a couple communists with like who actually do have Jewish heritage. So people are like, oh, what does he mean by this, right? It's so coded. It's so coded. It's so hard to break through. So if that wasn't clear enough for anybody, he also says, we have lived to see the day that the modern Shylocks have grown fat and wealthy, praised and deified because they have perpetuated the ancient crime of usury in the modern racket of statesmanship. Shylock. Yeah. Merchant of Venice. Okay. It's all there. He's very, he's not subtle. I wouldn't say he's subtle, but he does know how to just drop below the United States' ability to shut him up. I guess that's the game here. So another nice example of how he starts to use the language of social justice actually in his movements. We'll get to the union of that soon. This is what he says. Christianity, therefore, which insists that we love our fellow man, whether he be Jew or Gentile, black or white, does not intimate for a moment that we shall jettison the cargo of our patriotism, nor jeopardize the lastingness of our country. So again, love thy neighbor, okay, but we're white. You just as long as you get that. White. Yeah. All right. So the only other kind of like standout moment in this early work is around 31, where he begins to centralize the role of international bankers. In his sermon on the Treaty of Versailles, like longtime listeners probably hear all the red flags going up here, saying that a catastrophe happened and that catastrophe witnessed our sovereignty being passed out of our hands and into the unholy hands of the international banker, specifically at the expense of Germany, by the way. And he says this all happened poor Germany. He says this all happened without Christ. So that's quite specific. It's not without God. It's without Christ, which opens up a very nice segment of the population to rail against. So he starts talking about like silver markets in Mexico too. That starts to get kind of shoved in here. He starts to feel a little Alex Jonesy,
Yeah, I was about to say the longtime American right-wing media personality tradition of advocating for buying precious metals.
Yes, that's it right here. right here. Although his is a bit different. He advocates for the nationalization of precious metals, which you really don't hear a lot of today.
That is very different.
Yeah. So in 33, Colglin gets really interested in economics. And that's when you start to hear all the bankers and money changers and all that starts to come in and take center stage. And like almost all of his speeches become about that for a while. And so just a month before Hitler comes to power, Colglin gets on the air and he advocates for, and this is where that comes in, the national confiscation of all gold to be taken from the Rothschilds, the Morgans, he throws in a curveball there, and the Kuhnlobes, yeah? So J.P. Morgan, not Jewish, and it kind of opens the possibility, which he often says, that he's really only talking about bankers, right? Because he throws in like a mix. So, and by the way, at this time, Colglin had important Jewish friends and allies and like funders even of this radio show. Like people that he knew back when he had finished seminary and was starting to become a priest, he made like Jewish friends who were rabbis and stuff like this. And they still kind of like looked out for him a little bit, and they would even defend him to their own people. And he had like the 10 Commandments displayed in Hebrew, for instance, so he couldn't possibly be anti-Semitic, that kind of stuff. But Coughlin really likes, pushing this envelope while still being like a cowardly piece of shit. So the next week, Coughlin gave a sermon called The Suicide of Capital, in which he railed against the exploitative Rothschilds of Europe, who claimed they were disparaging the teachings of their forebears, despising the precepts of their great leader Moses, mocking the doctrines of the Talmud and the precepts of the Old Testament. J.P. Morgan is gone at this point. His main gripe was on this, like, the pagan principle of charging interest on debts. But I don't think that was really his problem with them. That's my guess. But finally, Coughlin says, under the flag of their leadership, there assembled the international bankers of the world. The horrible, hated word spelled W-A-R, which was the secret of their success. Aha! So how do they get all this money? Causing white people to go to war. So now you've got all your basic ingredients for like a really good, pogrom and shit like that. And that's not lost on his listeners who do start to prepare for such a pogrom. But if you want to hear about that, you're going to have to get to our Silver Shirts episode. A little down the road there. So now we're on part 3, the rag. So you got a sense of his radio presence, his like kind of sneaky mixing of anti-Semitic, and honestly, a lot of creation of some anti-Semitic tropes too. He was a little bit creative, more creative than most of our Nazis.
Certainly way more influential.
Oh yeah. So like I said, Colglin and FDR fell out, and Chaz's ambitions led him to want to be president. So in November 11th of 34, he had a ton of cash at this point. He's like, his radio show is just taken off completely. His printed sermons are selling. He's got a lot of wealthy backers. So he forms himself something called the National Union for Social Justice, which is styled on a kind of a popular movement with a party arm that is just called Union. So the overarching National Union for Social Justice function, which NUSJ, you'll see it. In my head, it says NUSJA, which I'm probably going to call it more than once. So if I say NUSJA, that's what I mean. Apparently, this functioned as more of like a reserve of his political power and sort of distribution points, networking nodes, etc., and places where he could like safely host rallies, stuff like that. So decades later, this white supremacist political activist named Edward Reed Fields claimed that at its height, up to something like 400 Irish police in New York City were members of NUSJA, which is important because a lot of crazy shit goes down in New York City. So NUSJA, the National Union of Social Justice, offers 16 guiding principles to their followers. A couple of these, just a handful of them, would be liberty of conscience and education. Liberty from whom, you might want to ask. Nationalization of resources too important to be held by individuals. The abolition of the Federal Reserve. Return to Congress the right to coin and regulate money. Rights of workers to organize unions. Curveball. Requisition of wealth and the conscription of men in times of war. And the principle that human rights should outweigh property rights. Interesting. So at first glance, it looks like a nice little mix. You might even a little bit of the right, a little bit of the left. When has it ever gone wrong? So And of course, like, you know, any mention of the Federal Reserve obviously sends up red flags for today's, you know, listeners.
Yeah.
Every politician today in the Democratic or Republican ranks sits upon one of the thrones of the mighty, doesn't believe in that part of the Constitution.
But on the face of it, it appears to offer like a lot to the quote left and a lot to the quote right, but it's not the case. And the party, honestly, is like the least interesting element of the whole story because, I mean, it was led by Colglin, this guy named Gerald L.K. Smith, who was a Nazi sympathizer who later went on to help form the America First Party with Charles Lindbergh, which we will get to.
And also the Christian Nationalist Crusade.
Oh, yeah? Oh. Is that him too? All right.
Yeah. Like an anti-Semitic. Yeah.
That's a hell of a name.
Yeah. Besides that, it was all nationalization, Federal Reserve, American silver to back the dollar, just kind of monetarist stuff. But as boring as all that shit was, his rhetoric was still like spicy, you know? God-fearing Americans now have the opportunity to seize back control of their country. FDR stands for Franklin double-crossing Roosevelt. Why is it that the Communist Party has endorsed Roosevelt for president? He is a liar and a betrayer. The White House lies on the rotten meat of broken promises.
As another presidential election approaches, a Roman Catholic priest, for the first time in American history, is seriously involved in national politics.
Some are unpopular, but God hates the hypocrite.
So following his complete failure to amass any significant votes, the National Union for Social Justice begins to publish a little rag titled simply Social Justice, starting from March of 1936. So the title itself is in reference to Pope Leo XIII, who called for a version of social justice based on Christian principles through which both communism and capitalism wiped away. So from this weekly periodical, which was thought to be like more of an editorial supplement to his radio sermons, all sorts of nasty shit comes out of this. The worst of which is definitely the Christian Front, who we're going to spend a lot of time on in a second. So Social Justice, the magazine, like I said, mirrored Couglin's speeches and stuff like this. And whenever Coughlin would say something super anti-Semitic, people would say, hey, that was super anti-Semitic. And Coughlin would respond in Social Justice, claiming that not only was he not anti-Semitic, but the claim that he was anti-Semitic was made by Jewish liars. You know,
Interesting.
Yeah, wrap your noodle around that one.
I know that like he used this radio show to promote Mussolini sometimes, but then when Mussolini was criticized for adopting some like anti-Semitic laws or adopting the German program, he invited on air Mussolini to come and write for Social Justice in order to clarify his position on the Jews.
Yeah. Yeah. That was really, the thing he was most concerned with for sure. Okay, so people still latch on to his own claims that he's against all forms of prejudice and that garbage. And also because, he urged like the good Jews to like come out and announce that they're against the Bolshevik program and stuff like that. So, of course, Coughlin carefully distinguished between the good and the bad Jew, and that comes up a lot. So the bad Jews all control the international banking system and the media and the Roosevelt administration and communism, and, what's anti-Semitic about that? It's all facts, and the good Jews are the ones that come out and admit that they control the whole world and are against it.
I challenge every Jew in this nation to tell me that he does not believe in it.
And none of them are coming forward. So where are the good Jews, So I suppose this is enough for people to look past the fact that he published let me back that up. Like, I wonder how people that are trying to rehabilitate Coughlin look past the fact that he also, much like Henry Ford, published weekly supplements of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, of course, in Social Justice for like a straight month. And this is not that long. It's like 5 years or so after the Dearborn Independent was publishing their protocols too. So I mean, he's carrying the torch. He was buddies, like I said, to Ford, who's Dennis Fahey, Oswald Mosley was a fan, Ezra Pound. he was tight with. It was also argued at this time that Colglin began to promote the strong isolationist stance, warning his listeners about plots by the Jewish bankers to make a war with Germany, and suggesting that FDR was bewitched by the Jews in his cabinet. So, all right. Okay. And then we get to like some of his best work, I would say. And that is surrounding Kristallnacht. So, yeah. So basically, just to put it in context, he's republishing the protocols after the summer of 38, shortly after calling for the formation of a Christian front, which would be like a bulwark, implicitly armed bulwark against the Bolshevik plans for America. And so in October of that same year, of course, Kristallnacht happens in Germany on November 9th, about a month after thousands of Polish Jews are like expelled from their homes and stuff like that. So a little shy of 2 weeks after this, he's like radio silent for a week, which is interesting because that's not usually the case. But on the second week, he comes back, blasts Ave Maria on his sermon, on his radio show, and then like just gets on to say basically,
2 weeks ago, the minds of our American citizens were focused upon the latest outburst of Nazi persecution. Every newspaper heralded abroad the news of a $400 million fine imposed upon 600,000 German Jews by a government which already had restricted the liberties of Catholic and Protestant and Jew. A government which, thanks be to God, has not resorted officially to the guillotine, the machine gun, or the kerosene-drenched pit. I seize the opportunity to raise my voice not only in condemnation of this latest manifestation of persecution, but to amalgamate the forces of a sympathetic world against all persecution. Without attempting to minimize the atrocities of Nazism, I drew to the attention of this audience the excesses of communism. Let us distill our sympathies not only from the tears of the oppressed Jews, but also from the lifeblood of 20 million Christians.
And this is something he does say, this is a quote.
I insisted that Nazism was only a defense mechanism against communism.
Yeah, that's his real thing. So on one hand, you got the claim that the Jewish Bolsheviks are just slaughtering Christians by the million, which not the case, by the way. We'll talk about that in a second here. But also that, and that Nazism is bad. It's bad, but it's a natural defense mechanism. I mean, how mad can you get, right? And he literally can't mention Nazis without bringing up communists. Whenever he talks about Nazis, he talks about the communists, but he doesn't do that when he talks about the communists. When he talks about the communists, he talks about the Jews. You know, that's who else he talks about. So you can see this hierarchy of interests here. And he claims, of course, that even though he goes on to blame the Jews for Kristallnacht, saying that basically the Jewish people owe Christendom like $80 million or something like this, he says that it's the Jewish controlled press that gives him the image of being an anti-Semite. It's amazing the disconnect here, like how rabidly anti-Semitic he can be. He even says like he defends Henry Ford on air from rabbis. So nothing to see here, you know. So of course this is all complete bullshit. It's only Nazi apologia, and but about these numbers, tricky business numbers. I don't like numbers. Not just because I am a bad historian, but because I'm a bad mathematician, and they don't mean anything to me. But I did have to spend some time on his number game here because it's insane. Like he regularly claims that between 20 and 25 million Christians were martyred to Soviet communism, specifically Christians, specifically martyrs. And I'm not just in the way of like, oh, they were Christian and they were killed, so they're martyrs, but in the way that these were like people who were killed because they were Christian. That's really important. So the absolute highest number that I could find, and this is by 1938. So by the time he's speaking, right, that's like the cutoff here for his like number game, is something like maybe 120,000, which is a lot. It is. That's a lot of dead people, but it's not 25 million. And that 25 million number seems to come from some studies in the 80s that I read. It actually comes from the Russian Orthodox Church itself. That was the number that they were telling people at the time. Interestingly, so maybe it was like 120,000 Christians, right? The Tsarists killed between 100,000 and 150,000 Russian Christians shortly before that. So that's also an interesting little thing that you don't hear much about. And on top of that, the amount of pogroms against the Jews leading up to that period was also around 150,000. So like, even if Coughlin was referring to the Stalinist purge of that time, which was something like maybe 1 million people, the brunt of that was borne by like communists and stuff like that were like apostate, So like, again, insane fantasy number that he throws out there, but he's got a third of the country more or less considering that, Jews are killing millions upon millions of Christians as he speaks. And then we're supposed to feel bad when a bunch of their businesses get burnt or something like that. That's his whole thing.
Right.
All right. He says shit like this. By all means, let us have the courage to compound our sympathy not only from the tears of Jews, but also from the blood of Christians. 600,000 Jews whom no government official in Germany has yet sentenced to death.
Wow.
Yeah. So, right. Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty on the nose there.
Right. So this guy, Donald Flam, he's the station manager at WMCA in New York, which broadcasts this Kristallnacht speech. And he was like super nervous about what Colglin was going to say when the priest proposed giving this sermon. And Flam claims that he directly warned Colglin not to say anything anti-Semitic, right? He said that our station is uniformly opposed to anti-Semitism, but here have an hour of time, I guess. And he also asked Colglin to give him the planned speech for review, right? And for once, like, Chaz complies. He sends the speech. Flam reads it and is like, writes back, like, what the fuck is this? And Coughlin writes back, it's all true, man. It's just the facts. So Flam says, well, let me just call some fact checkers in here and we'll see what the facts are. And so they go through it and they edit like what they can. And they take all this like completely made up shit and they replace it with what they understand to be the facts of the time. And they give it back to Coughlin to review and revise and send them the final version again 48 hours before the broadcast. So the 48 hours passes. He doesn't send the final version. And for some dumb fucking reason, Flam, I guess, decides to let him go on with it anyway. So just before Colglin launches into this, like, the Jews are responsible for Kristallnacht thing, WMCA plays one of these, this guy does not necessarily represent the views of this station and that kind of thing. And so after the speech, Flam says that he and his whole like room were just in shock, but you got to ask, like, why not just fucking pull the plug? But whatever. So at any rate, WMCA concludes this broadcast with a very simple statement, which is, unfortunately, Father Coughlin has uttered many misstatements of fact today. And that's it. And later, Flam says that he wishes that he hadn't edited the speech at all and just let him do it, because it was so full of just madness that, like, he believes it would have cost Coughlin his audience anyway. And he feels like he fixed Couglin's Kristallnacht speech, and he feels very bad about that. But I don't know. You were the station manager, dude. You could have done more. Whatever.
So anyway, maybe just
a week
not
later,
allow
Goebbels
him to talk. I mean,
that's what I'm saying. Just don't fucking let him talk. So a week later, Goebbels gives his own speech on the Jewish question in Berlin. A week later. And the similarities between these two speakers become impossible to ignore. Like, Coughlin literally imitates Hitler's mannerisms on stage. He doesn't speak on stage like he does on his radio show. His radio show, very calming, sonorous, authoritative. On stage, he's like screaming, his like fist is to his head, and then it's down on the ground again, and it's back up to his head and down on the ground again, and screams a lot and blah, blah, blah. But it's also kind of Huey Long-y. It's also Huey Long, and he was a big supporter of Huey Long. So I guess it's a mix of these things. He's just a populist speaker. All right, so finally, so the WMCA tells him on no uncertain terms that any future Power Hour broadcasts have to be submitted 48 hours in advance or they don't get broadcasted at all. This demand alone becomes a headline in Germany. That the fact that this radio station is trying to shut down their man, Coughlin, a reporter there at the time, notes that like suddenly everybody in Germany is talking about Coughlin. He's become like a hero of Nazi Germany, is what this man says. Coughlin refuses the stipulations. Numerous stations, New York, Chicago, etc., just drop him. Newark doesn't. Newark lets him go because it's Newark. Needless to say, his followers launch into protest for several months all over America with like chants like "send the Jews back to where they came from on leaky boats" and like "wait till Hitler comes over here." That's what they're fucking chanting.
Oh, damn.
Yeah, straight up. So let's talk about the front. The front. All right. So 1937 sees Colglin getting super cozy with Henry Ford through their mutual friend Ernst Leibold, who we talked about. That was Ford's like general manager, personal assistant, spy master, all that. Colglin compares Ford to Pope Leo, I guess because they're both anti-Semites. And that summer, Colglin schemed with Ford to establish a company union to break down organized worker resistance in the Ford plants. So, and there's apparently some connection between what we talked about in that first episode of this arc, the Battle of the Overpass, where that guy got his back broken and it's all on camera, stuff like that, and Couglin's own like union busting work at the Ford plant. Yeah, okay. So in short, Coughlin tried to make something called the Workers' Council for Social Justice, but the Ford workers, having been in this pitched battle with like the spirit of capitalism itself, saw right through it and were super angered by this, and that might be one of the reasons why this like Battle of the Overpass was so well attended by the Ford workers. So I don't know, but anyway, and I also feel like this also gave Coughlin a taste for militant organizing, which he really hadn't really dipped into much before. All right. So on May 23rd of 1938, Social Justice issues an open call for the formation of a Christian Front, which is named after Franco's own answer to the Popular Front in Spain. And he's very specific about how it should be built. He tells you the cell structure of it, how many members you should have. You should have like 25 members, figure out who's a leader in those 25 members and get them to make 25 members somewhere else and spread like that. So their purpose, according to Colglin, was to, quote, study the principles of social justice, the establishment of programs for the poor, and preparations against the day when this front will be needed. Now, that gets interpreted in a number of ways, but I'll tell you about the most fun. So at the first Christian Front meeting, it was actually in Midtown Manhattan. We're far afield now from Detroit. 40 to 50 men met in this Paulist Fathers rectory in downtown Manhattan. The first speakers gave some lectures about the Jews being behind Martin Luther in order to split the Catholics from the Protestants. Participants said they were, quote, most desirous of joining the Protestants, however, to create a national movement. And then the next month, another meeting was held featuring a speaker named Hahn, who was a member of a private organization called the U.S. Immigration Board. Hahn also claimed to be a U.S. Secret Service agent and said that his position allowed him to see that, quote, thousands of Jews were pouring into the U.S. from every direction. And he closed with this thought: I'm a tough man. I'll tell you that there's only one thing to do, and that's to kill all the Jews. I'm impatient to use my gun on them, is what he said.
Damn.
Yeah. So that's like the first meeting. So Coughlin, feeling the vibe, went on air in 38 to say, our people have passed the point of being satisfied with a mere study club. I am convinced we are ripe for action clubs, and I look forward to the day, hopefully by 1940, where there would be 5 million marching under the banner of the Christian Front. And despite avoiding every suggestion that he was the leader of this front, probably because of Bishop Gallagher, actually, he nonetheless felt comfortable endorsing a couple of people to be the leaders, which you have to wonder how he had that power, as, having nothing to do with the front whatsoever. But
he's a spiritual father.
Yes, he holy waters them, whatever. So you got a couple guys that we're going to talk about real quick. One of them is Jack F. Cassidy, who's a law school student, and he was like, I guess, the official leader of the Christian Front, and he published thoughts like this. So this is Jack Cassidy. Organized along militant lines as defense mechanisms against red activities. We remember the word defense mechanism, natural defense mechanism for. Who else was that? Huh? Nazis were that. So as a protector of Christianity and Americanism, the Christian front is spreading from greater New York into Philadelphia, Boston, and other eastern centers. The invasion of Cleveland, Cincinnati, Detroit, Chicago, and other key cities of the Middle West will begin in August of, 1939. Sports and athletic prowess are two of the main objectives of the Christian front. They were all called sports clubs. This is what they were called. So in New York City, over the next year or so, reporters claim that New Yorkers were subjected to something like 40 street meetings every week from Christian Front people. And calling these things meetings is kind of a stretch. They were more like mobs. Like what they would do at their meetings is, this is a quote, running amok, spewing racial hatred, fomenting violence, staging street scenes never before witnessed in the city's history. That's my reporter voice.
Do they have any cool uniforms or?
You know what?
Like
no. That also was kind of scary about them, is that they didn't have these like elaborate costumes. They look like normal people. The same report noted the mob's composition as well. Admirers of Charles E. Coughlin and sundry hoodlums, crackpots and misguided patriots, and Bundsters. Bundsters! Huh? I feel like an idiot. I've been calling them Bundes this whole time. But Bundsters is way better. Yeah. Totally. Get this Bunst out of here.
Especially because I think...
Hey, Bunster, take a hike.
Because Bundes is also usually how people call a Jewish socialist party in Russia.
Yeah.
So,
Well, this clears it up. So they're Bundsters. What a Bundster this guy is. All right. So their repertoire of street activism was mostly stuff like assaulting people and insulting people that they thought looked a little Jewy. They would sticker anti-Semitic slogans onto Jewish businesses. They created a, quote, Christian index that they were keeping for an eventual boycott. And then also just like street fights. That's what they did. Something like 250 fronters were arrested in this first few months in New York City, resulting in 120 convictions, which is a lot considering that, again, like 400 cops at a minimum were members of the Christian Front, in New York City alone. So, I mean, even like Jewish children were attacked from fronter children. Like it was a total war. So in Philly, these cells broke the windows of synagogues. They airdropped anti-Semitic leaflets over the city. They threatened to bomb the YMCA for hosting the Women's Peace League. And complete fucking chaos here. So in 1940, it was estimated that New York alone had 12,000 members. And a lot of these were not like... But that number is also kind of suspicious because a lot of these were not public-facing Christian Front meetings. A lot of them would be called like Anti-Communist Society or Committee for Constitutional Rights or the American Mothers Neutrality League was my favorite. Wow. But these are all Christian Front groups. So
front groups of the Christian Front.
Yeah. But once you would show up to these like front groups of the front, somebody would show up and invite everybody to like the real meeting, which would be like one of them is like in room 204 at the Copeland Plaza. Meet me at 4, and then they'd all just go there and have like a proper Nazi meeting. So as a fun side note, the Fronters also organized a small cell of anti-Semitic black folk in Philly, which is a fun little trivia point there. And they kept like a separate women's organization because they didn't want the women to be involved in the, quote, strong arm work to come. The pogroms is what they're talking about. So a New York City meeting in 1939 attended by an undercover reporter noticed that there was a prevalence of Iron Cross imagery, the open use of the Nazi Roman salute, and lots of people with cross membership in the Bund and the ANP also. And in the words like pro patria et Christo are prominently featured, so it was very kind of clero-fascist look to it. So a 29-year-old seminary dropout who had become an insurance agent, who's named Francis P. Moran, also took up Couglin's call here, and over the next couple of years pulled together, according to him, 20,000 people alone in New England. But it's funny, like, Massachusetts was, like, surprisingly reticent to get involved in this. Like, it was mostly under the sort of leadership of, what was his name? Cardinal O'Connell there, who was, like, the word of God for Boston Irish Catholics, and he didn't like Colglin. So a lot of Massachusetts also didn't like Colglin, which is funny because you would expect that to be like his natural hunting ground, as like a prominent Catholic. But really, he got a lot more support out of these like Protestant WASP types. So Coughlin openly praises this Moran guy, Francis P. Moran, and he names him somehow, even though he's not the leader, he names this man the National Director of the Christian Front in 1939. And one of Moran's favorite speaking tactics was like to stir his audience up into a frenzy, only to stop talking. When his listeners quieted themselves for like a while, just like, to be really quiet, he would then say like, "Who are the bloodsuckers plotting to send our boys to die in England?" You know, and of course, like the crowd would go like, "The Jews!" And they would all go crazy again. That was how he did it. So Moran was mostly focused on isolationism and avoiding war with Germany, of course. And FDR was specifically worried about Moran and how much influence he was getting there in Boston. And so Moran was also in touch with the German consul in Boston and showed films about the strength of the Wehrmacht to his followers, which was a big deal. Like this was also like one of the things that like Lucky Lindy, like Charles Lindbergh would do when he would basically say, we can't defeat the Germans. They're way too powerful. Blah, blah, blah. This guy also didn't like Einstein, just, side note. So while Moran went for a mass movement, right, in Boston, Cassidy, the other guy, Coughlin's earliest appointee, went right to terrorism and coup d'etat. So in 1939, in June, Cassidy and 17 other Catholic fascists from Brooklyn, most of them in their early 30s, hatched a very, very dumb plot. So they stole a bunch of ammunition from federal armories in New York. They started meeting secretly for rifle practice on the estate of one of a friend of one of the members. Also kind of base vibes again here. And at least some of their ammo was like donated to them from National Guardsmen at Fort Dix. So the plan is to launch attacks on the Navy Yards in Philly and Brooklyn, as well as Annapolis and West Point, that would somehow help to catapult this guy we're going to talk a little bit more about in a different episode, this anti-Semitic general named George von Horn Mosley, no relation to the other Mosley, into whatever position of power that would allow him to genocide the Jews of America. And Cassidy's cell had some connections to the IRA. And in fact, there was a terrorist in Dublin named Liam Walsh, who was picked up in London following a double bombing of London's rail stations based on information that informants in these cells got, right?
There were pro-fascist factions in the IRA. That's also maybe a possible topic for us at some point.
Interesting, yeah. Definitely. So the writer, there was a journalist writing about them, talking about this, that it was their fantastic little putsch, saying that they planned to bomb selected buildings, seize public utilities, blast bridges, terrorize Jews, appropriate Federal Reserve gold, and assassinate 14 congressmen and set up a dictatorship, and I guess do some sports. Which is a lot for 17 people to do, So, but I guess one of the differences between like this group and maybe future groups like the Base or Atomwaffen is that like most of these guys actually were National Guardsmen or Marine Reservists or something like that. Most of them were military. Okay, so the plot of the Brooklyn Boys, who called themselves, by the way, the Country Gentlemen Sports Club, finally got raided. Yes, finally got raided by the FBI in January of 1940, who uncovered thousands of rounds of ammunition, powder, 17 rifles, automatic pistols, a shotgun, and a long sword. Yes.
Yeah, also the cold weapons.
Always. Long swords in particular, yes. Yeah. The Highlanders in this. So at first, Colglin completely disowns and denounces the whole cell. Of course, he calls them fake fronters, and he makes up some lie, like some easily verifiable lie that was found out days after he said it, that he like received a check for $1,000 from them, and he refused it on principle,
Fed fronters.
Fed fronters.
You know about Fedwaffen?
Fedwaffen? I don't know about Fedwaffen.
Okay. There was a series of videos published by some Atomwaffen group, but the Atomwaffen group didn't know who these people are, so they called them Fedwaffen. But...
Yes, this is that. Yeah, the original Fedwaffen. So he denounces them, and then a week later reclaims them and starts to defend them and says he never denounced or disowned them. Also, I mean, like, just like how, like, Nicol and Mirna don't understand the internet, I think Colglin doesn't understand text, Okay, it's a common problem for this.
The written word.
The written word. It always gets him, I think the reason why he re-owned them was because the trial wasn't really going anywhere of these people. Like, nobody believed that 17 people really posed a real threat. And they were, a lot of the jurors slowly came to believe what Colglin's propaganda machine was saying with the help of the American press, which was that this was somehow an alarmist thing that the FDR administration was doing to try to turn people against a certain politic, and like build a sort of a Nazi scare. Okay. So that ends and then basically like most of these people got out without any jail time whatsoever. So yeah, I mean, Colglin would say that the charges were completely fabricated, for instance. And by the way, this is when the KKK says Catholics are okay now. Was when these guys get arrested. So on January 28th of the next year, Coughlin delivers a radio address in which he chides Americans for valuing democracy more than devotion to Jesus Christ. Coughlin denounces the view that the church and the state should be separate. In response to claims that he and the Christian Front are anti-Semitic, Chaz cites some rabbi who I guess said once that like a lack of faith in God and not anti-Semitism is the biggest problem for Jews today. He always had these like quotes ready to go. He then goes on the counteroffensive against his own detractors. And finally, he implies that the arrest of the Christian Front is equivalent to when the Romans sort of unthinkingly arrested Jesus Christ, following orders. That the cops are not exactly at fault. They're just like the Romans who arrested Christ. They're just, unbelievers, whatever. So let's talk about his fall now, and then we'll get to the end here. So at any rate, yeah, like I said, almost all these conspirators get off the hook when the trial ends in June, and the jury didn't buy the plot was realistic enough. But at this time, the tide had already kind of turned for Coughlin, and he starts to fall from grace. So first of all, his first line of defense against the Vatican, Bishop Gallagher, finally bites the dust in 1939, and it leaves him exposed to like more critics from the church. And the guy that replaces Gallagher is really not one of Coughlin's people. So his old buddy Kennedy falls in line behind the war effort that Coughlin had been railing against this whole time. And Kennedy begins to denounce Coughlin now, to keep his position and stuff. And so in 1941, social justice is banned on all U.S. military bases, which prompts social justice to make a headline, Jews plot to ban social justice. And finally, in December of 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor, of course, turns all the public opinion against isolationism. And Coughlin starts to get saddled with accusations of divided loyalties between Germany and the U.S. So Attorney General Biddle now goes for the gullet and kickstarts a hearing to revoke the second-class mailing rights of social justice, saying that we can't send enemy propaganda along federally funded lines, which would effectively kill it, because like they'd have to start paying for their own fucking postage now, like in first-class mail. And that takes a huge chunk out of Coughlin's like enormous profits. So at the same time, Biddle starts on the side drawing up sedition charges against Coughlin as like a quote last resort. But before the hearing or the charges are filed, maybe because they are really looking for like a quieter solution to this, Biddle meets with a Christian international banker named Leo Crowley, who is tight with Gallagher's new replacement, whose name is Bishop Mooney. And so, again, the old conspiracy of international Christian bankers and stuff working against Coughlin. So Biddle sends a message to Mooney through Crowley that the administration is willing to, quote, deal with Coughlin in a restrained manner if Mooney would order Coughlin to cease his public activities. So on May Day, incidentally, of 1942, Mooney comes to Coughlin, thank you for your service. Now shut the fuck up, or we're going to defrock you. And Coughlin loves to be frocked, hates defrockment. So Coughlin abides and shuts up. And he becomes a parish priest in 1942, which he remains until 1966. And then he finally dies in 1979 near Detroit, but not before giving a couple of interviews that are, by the way, recovered. They're lost to most of history, but recovered by this great historian, Donald Warren, who wrote this book and then sadly himself died shortly after. But they're in there, and it's basically stuff like old Coughlin. Coughlin says that he's got like a book of every Jewish genealogy, and he can prove that Roosevelt was a Jew. He was really Rosenfeld, which was like a common thing at the time to say, and blah, blah, blah. But like way up to his death, he's still like having interviews with people who can't fucking publish these interviews because he won't stop talking about Jews.
I wonder if Mooney like held anything else above his head. I mean, it's kind of...
I wonder too, because
it's kind of interesting how he completely went silent for that long. I mean,
yes, yeah. I wonder if there was some kind of financial agreements going on too, because Coughlin was in debt to the Catholic Church for this original construction of the church, which, despite making money hand over fist, never bothered to repay. So maybe.
Yeah, I wonder what they pulled there.
So we're going to close this episode on the last chapter of the story, which is called The Grift. And I think this is like that final little piece of the puzzle that really explains a lot of like loose threads in Coughlin's story. So, like I said, Chaz was a shyster. He was, we really need to look at that. So if you recall, Coughlin built the original Little Flower Church, right? To be that sort of wooden mega church with theater seating for 500 people, despite having only 25 families. Well, in 1931, after he completes his new radio tower, Coughlin starts working on building an entirely new church structure, with more money loaned from the Vatican, as he did with the previous design. So the loan is, again, massive. And despite like his success, it does look like Coughlin was going to get stuck with the loan personally. That is, like, the money wasn't, I guess, going into the church. He'd personally have to pay it down from his own money. So he does what any devotee of the faith would do, and he prays. I'm joking. He burns his church down. I'm pretty sure. Look, that's like my theory here, but it really, I mean, come on. So officially it just catches fire. But the outcome is that the insurance ends up paying off his debts and a lot of phase 2 of this new construction process, which was already starting to be done out of stone. So you might be tempted to say that could be a coincidence. It could be.
That's how it's done, Coughlin.
Yeah. But he's got like more shit like this. So basically, another example of Coughlin's like chiseling is that his only full-length monograph text and his only actual like theoretical work is a 180-page monetarist economic treatise called Money, Questions and Answers. So in it, Coughlin mostly goes after the Federal Reserve, the money changers, blah, 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 nationalization of gold and silver. We know that part. So nothing really special here, except that this book stood in for his unique angle in political economy. That this was like promoted Coughlin as an economic thinker, as a Renaissance man in this. So the thing is, Coughlin did not write this book. Coughlin had this fan. Her name was Gertrude Coogan, who Chaz hired to write this as like a ghostwriter for him. Coogan is very interesting. Gertrude Coogan is her name. Coogan is, I'm pretty sure she was the first woman MBA in the world. She was also a raging anti-Semite whose family had to have like a family intervention to get her to like go on vacation. They said like, go to the lake house, stop thinking about the Jews. That's what they did. Didn't work at all.
They could have lobotomized her too.
They could have gone the Kennedy method, they call it. Yeah.
Scramble that brain a
Kennedy
little.
method. So,
scrambled anti-Semitism out.
Yes, get in there. All right. So she's born into a wealthy family in Illinois. She eventually becomes a business consultant in Chicago, makes her own money that way. And Coogan had already authored her own work on the evils of the Federal Reserve, claiming that it was a tool for the international bankers to control America. She saw in Coughlin a way to launch her critique into this public spotlight. And basically, Gertrude's argument, you could look at it as like a critique of finance capital and its impact on like creating depressions. But her main inspiration came from a Nobel Prize winning physicist named Frederick Soddy, who authored a major work on virtual wealth in 1926 that focused specifically on Jewish international finance and the root of its failure in modern capitalism. So like from the beginning, she's I think she became an economist to like, whatever, battle the Jews or something. So Coughlin ends up making about $50,000 in like old timey money in profit from this book. That's like in today's money, that's something like 30,000 short of $1 million today. So this is like a huge surprise for Coogan, who was told by Coughlin that they would be selling this book at cost, right? Also, she would later complain to the half-dead Bishop Gallagher that he promised to make her the financial editor of Social Justice and that he would cover all of her research expenses while he was in Detroit. He didn't. Instead, he made her stay with his mom and didn't give her any money, ever. And he says that Coogan is engaged in some plot to destroy him. and that all of this is an elaborate lie to take him down, and refuses to acknowledge that Coogan had written any of it at all. And so, and Bishop Gallagher, again, trying to like just keep food down, just did not give a shit about any of this. So Garrett goes all the way to the Vatican, and to talk to some other toothless old guys, and they didn't care either because it was just like a money dispute between anti-Semites, and it's not really their business. So she bottled it all up inside and just became a racist grandmother, and finally, before she died, put a book out called "Only You Can Stop Inflation," and then dead. So apart from giving Colglin his economic theory, apparently, she also gave him a lot of his anti-Semitic talking points. So he owes her quite a lot. This is a quote from Donald Warren's book again. He interviewed a friend of Gertrude's shortly after Gertrude's death. So this is what he says. Recalling her recently deceased companion, Mary Larkin pointed out that Coogan was terribly upset about the Jewish influence. She said our country was sold, and that Garrett was a personal friend of Nancy Reagan's mother, Edith Luckett Davis. She came into Garrett's office about once a month. Reagan knows the situation, she would say. But she says, they're all held. They can't do anything, she said. If only you knew the intrigue in Washington that the Jew has on the country. And Larkin added that Garrett never believed that business about the Holocaust at all. There you go. So fuck her. I'm glad she got screwed. But you do get a sense of Colglin's character. So I think the last little story is sort of how... Oh, I'm sorry. We got to talk about his Nazi connection. All right. Just on the Colglin being a sneaky fucker line. His relationship with Germany was pretty fun. So it made him, like I mentioned, he was like a darling to the Nazis. When the radio station banned him, it was headline news in Germany. So publicly he denounced Nazis whenever he could, of course always comparing them to communists. But in reality, Colglin was receiving direct funding from the Nazis, and his work was closely followed and distributed by the Nazi administration. And when Detroit's federal court was holding deportation hearings in 1943, this American Nazi Party member named Fritz Ebert, in the process of losing his American citizenship, testified that he personally sent copies of Colglin's radio addresses to the highest party office, who promised to distribute them. Now that's not super sinister, but it shows that the Nazis took an active interest in Colglin. They said as much anyway. However, Warren himself conducted an interview with the former Third Reich official in the German Foreign Office, named Dr. Otto Ernst Braun, who confirmed that his office directly sent funds to Colglin, and this all happened under the auspices of a guy named Paul K. Schmidt, who was in charge of pro-Nazi propaganda in the U.S. before the U.S. got involved in the war. And when he was interrogated after the war, he admitted that Colglin was discussed with, quote, extraordinary frequency by his department in the Nazi government. And so to put a cherry on this little cake, there was a Ukrainian anti-communist Catholic convert turned FBI informant named Pelipenko, who had ingratiated himself on the behest of the FBI to Colglin, and confirmed that Chaz personally collaborated with the German consulate in Detroit, and he directly received funds from the consulate. And the actual consul himself was a man named Haler, who openly said that Colglin was one of their collaborators. He said that Father Colglin is our agent for spreading anti-British and anti-Semitic propaganda, and that he also carries for us a program amongst the Washington warmongers. The agent Pelipenko was even personally taken to Colglin's house by the consulate. So the consul drove him to see Colglin and introduced him to Colglin, where Colglin loved this guy and straight up offered him money for any anti-Semitic material he can get from a Ukrainian perspective. Pelipenko also testified that Colglin bragged about how close he'd gotten to the Ukrainian Nazi community Colglin had in America, including becoming a prominent member of the Ukrainian Hetman organization in Detroit. So, Nazi. And so, I think this final grift here, though, is not about money for once. This is just about his reputation, and that's a good place to end it. So basically, like I said, Jewish leaders in Detroit gave Colglin every fucking chance to explain his fucking bullshit. Originally supporters of Colglin, a lot of allies in the Jewish community, they were willing to give him a second chance, And so when Social Justice reprinted the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, the curtain finally fell there and nobody could deny his position anymore. So the founder of the Detroit Jewish News, his name is Peter Slomovitz, went and he basically called an anti-Semite. But he also called Coughlin a sadist, which Coughlin gave an entire speech about, like that Sunday. But being like a nice enough dude, Slomovitz sent a telegraph to Chaz that still gave him the benefit of the doubt. And like, listen to what this is the communication that Chaz is receiving from this Jewish editor, right? You are grossly misled, Father Coughlin, regarding the protocols and many other phases of Jewish life which you have undertaken to criticize at this juncture, when dictators are destroying every vestige of human decency and freedom for Jew and Catholic alike. Because I still consider you a man of decency, I urge you to meet with a small committee who will supply you with the basic facts proving to your complete satisfaction the libelous character of the protocols and other charges contained in your periodical. I mean, you can't get more diplomatic than this, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, dude publishes the protocols. This is the response he gets. This guy is a saint. So Slomovitz is giving Chaz like this huge second chance. They meet in person the next day to talk it out. So Slomovitz brings some other Jewish community leaders from Detroit to sit down with him. And Coughlin, when they come in, is already like pacing around his desk in a rage. They say he's puffing and flushed as they enter his office, and he's muttering about how he's not a sadist and how sadism is like an anti-Christian trope and shit like that. Yeah, right. So they calmly first remind him that Henry Ford himself has retracted officially his support for the protocols, right? And has made an official apology. We talked about that in the first episode of this arc. And in response, Colglin calls in his secretary and has her read to them the notes that she's made on the protocols that are going to be published in the second installment. And then after this, Chaz is like, enough. And then he just says, there are Jews who are not Jews, but who belong to the synagogue of Satan. And he follows this up with, there's no danger of anti-Semitism in America and that fascism can never happen here. He tells them to get a sense of fucking humor. And he says that Jews should be less fearful and less sensitive. And he finally claimed that he could prove to them that the Jews control the international finance. This was how he responded. So he reads them protocols, the elders of Zion, and then yells at them. So Slomovitz and his friends are like, listen, maybe we come back later when you've calmed down a little bit. You know, they very calmly leave. They schedule another meeting with Coughlin, but Coughlin never has it. So Coughlin, however, does agree to let Slomovitz write a rejoinder to the protocols in Social Justice that week that will appear alongside the second installment. So he actually did keep this promise. But appearing alongside Slomovitz's article was a smear piece about Slomovitz, which claims to report what actually happened in the meeting by somebody whose name is Ben Marcin, who does not exist. It's like a play on his secretary's name. So Ben Marcin, despite his ongoing struggles with existence, continues to write for social justice, producing an article called The Talmud as a Cause of Persecution, where he implies that Slomovitz pleaded with Coughlin. This is what he says. Slomovitz pleaded with Coughlin to suppress the facts regarding the realities of Jewish persecution. That's what he said. So that's about it. So, I mean, I think he burned his church down for insurance money, screwed a lady out of her book deal. But, I mean, like, his biggest grift of all, I think, was the idea that somehow still lingers today that he was not an anti-Semite, which I hope we've dispelled today.
Yeah, because he absolutely was.
Because he absolutely was.
I mean, extremely so, no? In all the possible ways, almost.
Yes, yes. Yeah, but I mean, what a fucking grifter. I mean, and also the guy, just the fact that when his first church had seating for 500 people, I mean, it really makes you wonder, you know, how long he
was thinking big.
He was, yeah. He was always thinking big, yeah. So that's like a huge forgotten piece of the American political landscape. My family, of course, I've mentioned a few times, like I grew up Catholic. My parents never heard of this guy. Like he's just been kind of like quietly put aside.
But still respected by some, I guess.
It's hard not to listen to Bill O'Reilly when he was at his height without hearing Coughlin. Like, not just because they're both old Irish racists, but because like the way they present their arguments is like identical. Yeah, interesting guy.
Yeah, very. Well, yeah, that was a disturbing tale there, Father Fritz. Or Monsignor Fritz.
Yeah, Monsignor Fritz. That's my name.
So he died in the 70s, right?
Yeah, he did. Yeah.
And so what was his role? Like, did he have any kind of activity in the 60s or 70s?
The church kept his little trap shut. Like, again, like I said, like people tried to interview him, but those interviews never made it to the light of day. Like they were really.
So
I'll tell you one thing he did. Shortly before he died, he tried to donate his entire anti-Semitic library to the church in Detroit, who politely turned it down. Even though it
I
has
wonder who ended up taking it, though.
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a better question. Yeah,
he definitely didn't throw that shit out.
No. Somebody was very happy to receive it, I'm sure. Yeah.
So we don't know anything about his post-war, like, political sympathies, connections, or if even he had any.
No, I think mostly he, like, commented on the old days and then kept his nose out of current affairs, I think. That's the story that
I definitely feel like they must have held some shit over his head. I mean, to shut him up that well.
I wonder,
years.
Look, he's also, like, I think he's mostly, more than he is a Nazi, more than he is a Catholic, I think he's mostly a grifter. And I think he's a guy that also knew when to get out. You know, he knows a good deal when he hears one, and here's like a ticket out without the House of Un-American Activities coming for him, without the FBI coming for him, without having to answer for anything he did. He basically got a get out of jail free card. And I think he just took it. So
well, yeah, but a lot of Catholic clergy gets that.
Oh yeah, they're very good. They're very good at issuing those get out of jail free cards.
They're very good at, like, you know, getting people to shut up or moving them around, and you know.
Oh, we've been fucking kids for centuries. This is a cinch.
Yeah.
I mean, fuck a kid if you want. All right, guys, let's close it off.
All right.
All right, so we're gonna hear more of Coughlin here and there. He'll show up now and then, so will his like associates. Like we're gonna hear about James True in a future episodes. We'll hear more about the America First movement. So we're not done with Coughlin yet, but now you know what a piece of shit he was.
Indeed.
Yeah, Father Coughlin.
Father Coughlin. And with that, my children, I bid you good luck, good night, and the good Jews. Sorry, I just cut that out. I don't know where I was going with that.
It is completed.
It is complete. Yeah, it is completed.
When all else fails.
When all else fails,
it is
complete. All right, bye, guys.
Ciao.
Hey there, Fritz here from The Empire Never Ended. This has been one of our weekly free episodes for free people. But for premium people, we also have weekly premium episodes, which you can get at patreon.com/tenepod, TENEPOD, and also follow our various social media things in the show description there. Like and subscribe them. Follow them. Like and follow and subscribe. Follow them. Do it.